I'd like to begin by acknowledging the people whose lands these lecture pods are being recorded on, members of the Eora Nation, their elders past and present, whose countries were taken from them by force and which are unceded to this day. There are three main myths of racism that I want to pick apart. The first is that race is age-old and that all societies are racist. The second myth is that racism is natural and inherent to human beings. The third myth is that racism is out of the ordinary. Many people believe that racism has always been around. This Greek artifact, for example, represents a black face and a white face, giving rise to the idea that black and white as opposites was a feature of Greek thought. This may be the case, but it doesn't mean that ancient European societies believed in a hierarchy of races. The idea of racial difference between groups began around 1480 with early Christian European ideas about blood and purity that developed around the time of the Spanish Inquisition. Jews and Muslims were either forced to convert to Christianity or were expelled from Spain. Race further develops in the conquest of the Americas by Spain and Portugal, which led to the genocide of millions of indigenous people. Indigenous people were portrayed as non-human and thus either deserving of death, enslavement, or forced conversion. So race, rather than being age-old, emerges at a particular point in history when European nations started to invade and colonize other lands. The dispossession and genocide of the Aboriginal people in Australia was legitimated by spreading the belief that Indigenous people were inferior to white people. By the mid-19th century, racial science was booming. Eugenicists believed that it was necessary to eliminate so-called racially impure people, black people, Jews, Roma, but also the disabled and the poor. So over time, race, which emerges as an idea within a political context, colonialism and the growth of nations, comes to rely on science for its legitimacy. Racial thought sees people's outcomes as being determined by their genetic makeup. So Africans, for example, were portrayed as natural slaves and white people as born to rule. The next myth is that racism is something natural. Now, it's certainly true that no one avoids being racist in a racist society. But does this mean that racism is natural? As the picture shows, black men are often stereotyped as being scary. But where does this fear come from? Is it natural? In fact, the idea that black men are scary has to be constructed. Take the example of Mark Duggan. Police in London shot and killed the 29-year-old in August 2011. The media at the time portrayed Duggan as a thug. They wrongly reported that he was carrying a gun. In fact, the police shot him while he was unarmed. To help construct the image of Duggan as a criminal whose death was condonable, the media consistently used this image of him. What does he look like to you? But later, it was revealed that that Head and Shoulders photo had been cropped from this one, which was taken of Mark Duggan at his daughter's funeral. The heart he is holding up in the picture reads, "Daughter, always in our hearts." Instantly, our view of Duggan changes to someone we can empathize with. So we have learned here that fear is based on knowledge that we possess. We make associations between the person we see in front of us and stereotypes from the media, society, history, our families, and so on. In a racist culture, racialized groups are often reduced to gross stereotypes. The third myth I want to discuss is that racism is something that's out of the ordinary or extreme. We tend to associate racism with things like the alt-right, which is on the rise, fascist movements in Europe, or groups like this one, Reclaim Australia or United Patriots. But what about the less in-your-face racism? After the Second World War, many people were quick to paint the Nazi regime and its leaders as madmen, in contrast to the so-called rationality of those in the Allied countries. But Australia was one of the countries that fought the Nazis, yet at the same time, Aboriginal people, including those who had fought for the British, were not considered citizens and faced brutal racism. So racism doesn't only exist at the fringes of society. It's not just about the extreme violence of the far-right neo-Nazis, although that is certainly a worry. Racism can maybe be more dangerous when it is not overt, but more covert and implicit in our institutions and social relations. For example, while it's no longer legal to bar ethnic minorities from working in certain professions, it may be more difficult for them to enter them because of racist social conventions. A campaign in the UK, for example, asks, "Why isn't my professor black?" to highlight the fact that academia continues to be dominated by white people. In summary, racism is neither age-old nor natural, nor is it only extremist. Racism is modern. It develops under historical conditions, colonialism, imperialism, transatlantic slavery, and the rise of the nation-state in Europe. While it is certainly a feature of the extreme right, it also exists in mainstream politics and everyday public and private institutions like schools and workplaces. It is a part of our culture.